I always struggle a little bit to say Happy New Year, given the way the year is off to a start. But Happy New Year and welcome, Jasper. Great to have you with us. We've tried to have you here for about 6 months, and we finally nailed you down on the calendar. So welcome.
Thank you, John. Great to be here. And thank you, Rachel. And it's so great to see everyone.
Yeah, good way to kick off the year. So, just as a little bit of context, Jasper and I met when I was sharing office space with Harmonia, an impact-focused family office, and Jasper, I can't quite remember. I just remember you wandered in one day and you were working on one or more of their investment projects, and now here you
Mhm.
are, 6 or 7 years later, living in San Francisco, a Dutchman running RSF Social Finance, or at least what I think of as RSF Social Finance. And one of the reasons we wanted to get you on last year was it was the 40th anniversary of RSF. So for those that are not familiar with RSF, maybe just give us a quick tutorial and a little bit of a short 40-year history.
Great. Happy to do that. And again, thank you, John, for inviting me on this call. And it's so great to see many familiar as well as many unfamiliar faces from across the globe. So this is really such an honor to share this time and virtual space with you all. So yeah, about RSF. So in 1984, a school burned down, a Waldorf school burned down, and several of the members of that community wanted to support the rebuilding of that school and wanted to provide a loan so that the school could be rebuilt. And multiple individuals put some money together, and that's when RSF was born, because RSF then took that money, bundled it, turned it into a loan that they provided to the school. That was 40 years ago. And a lot has happened in between. Initially, there was mostly lending to not-for-profits. Then later, early 2000s, the scope was broadened to include healthy food and food and agriculture, really expanded beyond just the nonprofit world. And more recently, we added a strong climate lens, clean energy, climate solutions, as well as an overarching social justice lens across all of the work that we do at RSF. And in a nutshell, RSF really does three things, and those three things all ladder up to our mission, which is finance change, change finance. Those two things for us go hand in hand. They're self-reinforcing. So we change the financial system by financing change makers. And we finance change makers, those organizations that are making an impact and making a difference in the world in such a way that collectively we're actually changing the system from inside out. So those three things that we do are we provide individuals and organizations the opportunity to align their capital with their values, so they can invest with RSF. Then we make loans to social enterprises that make the world a better place. And we also manage donor-advised funds on behalf of our clients. And I'll stop there, John.
No, that's great. And I don't know, are you aware that your fellow Dutchman, Peter Blum, uses that same phrase?
I am. It originated actually with a professor who worked with the United Nations back in the 1960s. And
No, no
it's
such thing as a new idea.
exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
cool. Well, I love it, and I guess I've personally gravitated from the focus on financing change to the focus on the idea of changing finance, because I now refer to it as the finance or as the finance algorithm. It is just this superpower force
Yeah.
that runs our lives more than we have any idea, I think. And so at any rate, thanks for that quick tutorial. And just again, in maybe I missed it, just to give everyone a sense of scale and scope. So balance
Yeah.
sheet, breadth, target sectors, US only,
Yeah.
I think, still, last I checked.
Yeah, it's US and a little bit of Canada, but it's mostly US only, and that's just by charter. That's the scope that we can have. So, in terms of the types of industries and projects that we finance, it's education, it's food and agriculture, what we call regenerative food systems, which includes consumer products, companies, etc. And then it's clean energy and climate solutions and community building and social justice, which is also a cross-cutting lens. So, and in terms of the types of organizations, they're not startups. So these are established companies and organizations, as you said, in the United States. And they're usually small to mid-sized. Loans vary from $500,000 to $5-6 million each. And then, in terms of the total size of RSF is about $200 million at this point.
Which is about twice the size of it when you started, in terms of the balance sheet. Isn't that about right?
Not quite. We had there were ebbs and flows, with COVID, where we really focused on making sure that our borrowers were healthy and could, continue to, I mean, financially healthy. There were other aspects of health there as well. But so our focus during those 2.5 years was really not on growth. It was on
Right.
doing the right thing, by not focusing on raising more money, but focusing on supporting these borrower organizations.
Right.
Yeah.
Somehow I remember the balance sheet being 100. Maybe that's
Yeah, it was
longer.
a little earlier, but
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And this is my favorite part. You've also rebranded. So tell us about that
Yeah. Yes.
with
So
the 40th anniversary.
yeah. We did, and this is of course a huge effort and a team effort. So I really want to appreciate our team. Um, Will specifically, who I think is on this call as well, who helped make this possible. So rebranding is always it has something to do with identity, right? With the expression of the identity to the outside world. And RSF has had multiple of those rebrandings. So we originated as the Rudolf Steiner Foundation back in 1984. Then in the early 2000s, that shifted to RSF Social Finance, um, more or less at the same time when RSF started to fund organizations that were really outside of the Waldorf world, food systems, as I said, natural products, etc. And we rebranded just recently, a few months ago, to RSF Regenerative Social Finance. And I'll explain that a little bit. And, of course, there's attribution to you, John, and your white paper that you wrote in 2015 about regenerative economics. And we are, as you said, there's no such thing as a new idea, but you had one, and I want to credit you with that. And
That's not what you're getting paid to say.
well, and but we found a lot of the principles and really founding ideas around RSF reflected in the thinking around regenerative economics and regenerative finance. So yes, there's a little bit of a tongue in cheek of saying RSF, Regenerative Social Finance, but it fits so well because yes, we're all
Yeah.
about regenerative finance. And
Yeah.
for me personally, I've made it my mission to make all finance regenerative across the globe. We're not going to stop until we do that.
Yeah.
And that means we're on a mission to make finance and money a tool, and a tool for change and a tool for healing, rather than all the other stuff that everybody knows money is doing today.
Yeah.
So it fits so well. And,
Yeah.
part of this is also that we at RSF continue to get questions like, so what do these letters RSF stand for? And then we explained, and then folks would say, so how much money did this guy Steiner leave you guys? Because if you're a foundation that was named after an individual, we all know what the Ford Foundation does, right? We all know, I mean,
Yeah.
fill in the blank. So um, this was really a,
That it made it harder for fundraising.
well, that too, yes, because it was like, why do you need money? Because you're a
Yeah,
foundation. And we said, we have
yeah,
no money of our own. We steward other people's money. 100%
yeah,
of it is other people's money.
yeah,
And Rudolf Steiner did not start our organization, nor was he a donor. So that was part of it. So it's also an attempt to explain what we're actually doing
yeah,
and to set the tone around, well, also building a bigger tent, John. It was also about that because it felt a little restrictive to have this RSF social finance and to not have this regenerative aspect in it.
yeah, yeah. Well, before we jump in and ask you to share maybe a story or two about some of your projects and clients, um, well, let's do that. Let's actually, I want to actually bring in, a mini, not a mini conversation about Rudolf Steiner's ideas, but let's make first ground this in something very practical. And also just for people who are outside the United States and may not be familiar, the donor advised fund market that Jasper referred to is essentially in the United States, people can set up what's essentially a private philanthropic fund. You can fund these donor advised funds up front and get a tax return. And then typically the money sits in a mutual fund like Fidelity until you give the money away over the rest of your life. And I don't know, Jasper, what's the total size of this market now?
It's over $250 billion
Yeah. So it's real
that's
money.
sitting in donor advised funds.
And RSF was one of the early, impact investment oriented institutions that said, hey, that money ought to be put into impact. And so there's a trend in the United States of impact oriented institutions essentially pulling that money out of Fidelity and putting it to, better use in impact. And that's what Jasper's referring to on that side. But tell us, Jasper, about just pick one of your favorite companies or projects and tell us what regenerative finance looks like in the real world.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So one that I would pick is called Lotus Foods. And Lotus Foods is a company that has been around for about 25 years, and they sell rice and rice products. Um, Most of it organic, organic regenerative farmed as well. And they they bring in rice from smallholder farmers across several countries in Asia, where they work with the farmers and the communities on the ground to support these smallholder farmers, often women, that run these farms, that do the harvesting, that bring the product in. And they have developed a method. One of their founders, this is a couple that founded the company, and um, one of the founders invented a way to reduce the water usage while growing these organic crops. So there's kind of a trinity of impact, if you will. There's the social impact of supporting these smallholder farmers. You have an impact on planet and health because they don't use pesticides and all the stuff that's being put on that's being used in agriculture that pollutes and is also very unhealthy. And the third is it reduces water usage. And then they import the product to the United States and sell it at Whole Foods and Costco and what have you. And we have worked with them for um, a decade at this point, where we really supported them as needed. And one of the principles of regenerative finance that we developed as part of this rebranding is move with change as an overarching principle. We have a few of those, but move with change is one of them. And Lotus Foods is such a great example of a relationship where we were able to move with change. So initially, they needed a line of credit so that they could pay the farmers before they get paid by, say, Whole Foods.
Mm.
And for those of you who are in that type of business, you know that these entrepreneurs, they can grow broke by if the product actually is selling, then your demand is going to go up so fast that you need to buy this inventory, but you won't get paid until 30, 60 days later, especially when you come in from Asia. So providing a line of credit was their
And when
lifeline,
you have to
literally.
deal with Amazon on the other side of the
Well,
table.
they do now. They do now. Yes.
Yeah,
Let's. I mean, that's another conversation for
yeah,
sure. Um, but you will also find it at your local co-op. Let me put
yeah,
it that way. That's
yeah.
really the kind of company they are. Um, anyway, so we provided this small line of credit, and then as they were growing, there were term loans so that they could build and maintain a facility, additional lines of credit. So we've really grown with them and have also helped them with an equity investment, which RSF does very little of, but when the time was right for an equity partner to come in, that really feels like a three-way partnership between that equity partner, the company, the founders, and RSF. So that's one example. Another example,
So if I can just sort
John,
of
yeah,
jump in for a second. So, I would say that's a iconic regenerative or an iconic company that has a regenerative product and a regenerative business model.
yes,
Um, and I would say that I'm going to push you a little harder to sort of understand what has RSF done that's different from a good banker that, I mean, most bankers, I mean, when I was at JP Morgan, we would say, we grow with you, blah, blah, blah.
sure.
So, how have you dealt with the relationship? How is the relationship between RSF and Lotus distinct and different from a typical bank company relationship?
Yeah. The starting point for for us at RSF is we really want to understand the business and the people and build a relationship. That's where it begins. And you're right, every banker will say we're all about relationship. When we say relationship, we mean something else, right? It transcends the transactional. It's really building a relationship where you're really understanding where someone's coming from and where they want to be going. And then what's really different is that usually the initial conversation is about this is what we want, is what a company might say. This is what we want in, funding, blah, blah, blah. And after, really seeking to understand, having a conversation, seeking to understand, you land at a place of, well, this is what's needed. And then RSF may or may not be able to provide that. That's secondary. So it's really looking at what is the right thing and then figuring out a way, where might RSF fit in? Where are we going to make a phone call to somebody who we know can provide something that we can provide? So
Mm,
that's different.
mm,
What's also different is that we view relationship as a risk mitigant. So I know in classical banking, character is considered to be, one of the five C's in credit.
mhm,
We mean the relationship in a different way. So really having an understanding of how people behave, how a company behaves, how the mission really drives their behavior, and how the impact is at the core of who they are and what the company does, um, provides a whole different view into kind of the risk profile of a
mm,
loan and
mm,
of a relationship. So that is different. And on some level, I would also say it's really not different because we provide a loan, we do underwriting, right?
yeah.
We're not, um, going to be naive and say, we really like you, the relationship is so good, so here's a check. No, we steward the money of our clients, and we want to continue with that track record of never having lost a dime of our investors' money over 40 years. So that requires that we take a really good look at the numbers, that we do all the underwriting that a banker would do. It's just more, just like biodynamic agriculture, is organic plus. Just like, I would argue regenerative finance does not deny some of the basic principles that we have in our economy, but you look at it through a much more holistic lens.
Yeah, I think that's an important distinction. That there are many, many, impact entrepreneurs who are very frustrated with the impact investment space because, there's sort of an expectation that the capital ought to flow easier. And, if you guys have literally never lost a dime of investor money, you're making, quote, prudent loans to businesses, as you said, that are not startups. They've already got a proven business, and that's to me, part of the challenge is having banks and quasi banks, which I consider you guys as a quasi bank, who actually behave in a regenerative way, which doesn't mean they're necessarily going to be the first check into a raw startup. It means that the ongoing metabolism of an enterprise is fueled by capital that is aligned with these regenerative principles. And maybe tell us a little bit. I know you don't do this as a regular practice anymore, but I was very intrigued years ago to learn, in the spirit of trying to build shared understanding of of the relationship between the needs and pressures on a company, the borrower, and then the perspective of what are effectively, your investors. They're not depositors like in a bank, but they're effectively depositors in RSF, and
Yes.
their money is then on lent to your customers. And I was very intrigued. In fact, I intended to come to one of the meetings and I didn't make it, but you used to host meetings with some of your investor clients and your borrower clients to talk about what's a, quote, fair and appropriate interest rate. So maybe share a little bit about that.
Yes, for
Did,
sure. Happy
did
to.
people
So,
fight?
sorry?
Did people end up fighting?
Not that I know of.
Yeah.
Maybe the ones that were off camera. Um, but yeah, this whole thinking comes from the the understanding that shaping prices, and in our case, a price is an interest rate, right? Shaping prices is the exact same as shaping relationships. So rather than just leaving that to the anonymous market and just saying it is what it is, and Jay Powell said it's flat yesterday, so it's flat. I mean, we're not isolated from that at all, because everybody is moving around in a reality that we call a market reality. But the element that at RSF we added, and we've been doing this for about 15 years now, is we look at what are the economic needs, the realities of our borrowers at any given time. That can be between 60 and 100 or so different organizations. So there's no common denominator there, but we do look, and that is part of the relationship management. So understanding what their reality is on the ground, and then also having an understanding, again, through being close and being in conversation, of what the reality of our investor clients is, which again, there's a very broad spectrum, because our minimum is $1,000. There are people who have 1,000 or a few $1,000s in there, which for them may be a lot, and we have people who have several million in there, and it's not a lot for them. So there's again a huge spectrum, but taking into account what the needs of borrowers are, what the needs of investors are, and what the needs of RSF are, because we can only do this work when there's enough margin. so that we can absorb a loss once in a while of a loan, right, going bad, because that does happen sometimes, which is not losing the investor money in that. So there needs to be enough margin to pay the bills and to have a buffer so that we can continue to do this. So taking all of that into account, and looking at, what's the market doing at the same time, and what are investors and borrowers telling us, is what helps us make a decision about the pricing. And
Yeah.
you're right, John. In the past, we would host meetings, but as RSF has grown, we were noticing that that wasn't an inclusive way of doing it, because we had 3 or 5 people show up on a call and informing a decision. And we said, we need to make it broader, and we really need to listen to a broader audience as input for this decision.
Interesting. I'm just keeping an eye on the clock. Maybe let's jump in, unless you've got another. Well, let's jump ahead. I want to talk about Steiner. I'm sure there are. I see Martin Ping on the phone, or on the screen. He's a Steiner expert, and I'm sure many of us have attempted to read Steiner. But share with us maybe just a couple of the big ideas, the core ideas of Steiner that are still, in a sense, informing the culture of the organization.
Yeah.
And then in particular, I'm curious to kind of compare and contrast those ideas with what, we're now describing as this living systems regenerative paradigm.
Yeah. Thank you. That's great. And yes, I'm sure there are people on the call who are much more of a Steiner expert than I am.
Actually, I see
So,
Jeffrey there. Jeffrey Stamler, make a wave. Uh,
hi,
Jeffrey is
Jeffrey.
spent. Do you know Jeffrey?
I don't.
I roughly, if I'll get this right, Jeffrey has spent 20 years studying Steiner and is going to come out with the accessible Steiner summary for those of us who've struggled to understand what he had to say. So maybe, Jeffrey, before we end, you can give a little update on when your book's going to come out. But good to see you again.
That's wonderful. I look forward to that, because accessibility isn't always there with Steiner. So I'll, at least from my point of view, I'm just not smart enough.
But now know, Jasper, you've got a real expert listening in on you
Great.
who will correct us. So
Yes. Yeah. No, that's great. That's great. So let me just take a small step back to the origination of RSF. So our founders were inspired by Steiner's thinking. And for those of you who are not familiar, Steiner was a philosopher and a social thinker, who died pretty much exactly 100 years ago, living in Central Europe, and incredibly prolific writer and lecturer about a ton of topics. This includes economics and money and finance, but there's way more. So
yeah,
in
actually, I think I mentioned this. I think
yeah,
I read recently he's literally the most prolific human being that's ever walked the planet.
well,
I'm not sure if that's
um,
right, but he's certainly one of the most prolific, if that's not true.
yeah, it's we're definitely you know in yeah, I read somewhere 89,000 pages or something. So there's a lot there.
Jeez.
In any case, in the 1980s, our founders were really inspired by Steiner's thinking and Steiner's ideas around how to work with money differently and how to build an economy that's actually healing rather than extractive. And that is very much at the core of everything that we do at RSF
Yeah.
still. Um, what So let me lift up a few ideas that are still very much alive in how we think about working with money and working with money in a different way. And at the same time, we're also inspired by other thinkers and doers in this world. I'll mention Robin Wall Kimmerer, around indigenous wisdom. Um, um, what Kate Raworth, donut economics, John, what you wrote about regenerative economics. I recently read what Havel, the former Czech president, wrote about hope. So I want to say there's not a singular source of inspiration, but Steiner is definitely there from the get-go, from the early days, and it's important to recognize lineage, and that's also why we did not move away from the letters RSF. They're still there, and so anyway, those three ideas. I will lift up social threefolding, which is essentially, looking at three realms of society. It's very much a macro view of the economy, politics, law, and human rights, and cultural institutions. And what Steiner did is he basically applied the ideals of the French Revolution to those three realms, where he says, in cultural institutions, think science, arts, education, religion, media. The principle of liberty and freedom should be the leading principle there. In the rights sphere, when it's about law, about politics, equality and equity should be the leading principle. And in economic life, it's not freedom, right? But it's what in the French Revolution they called fraternité, right? It's the brotherhood and sisterhood. It's about collaboration and cooperation, which is reflected in how we work with our borrowers and investors and our clients. So that's one idea. Another one around associative
Just on that, it's
economics.
interesting as I think about sort of where our country is going and where it's gone wrong. The embrace of freedom hasn't had the nuance of where freedom should focus as opposed to freedom for the sake of freedom. And it's either sloppy thinking or intentionally corrosive thinking. But the notion that freedom in the economic sphere is just the same as freedom in the cultural sphere is just sloppy thinking.
Yeah. I think it's sloppy thinking and also often self-serving thinking, right?
Yeah.
It's a continuation of the extractive model that
but it's self-serving, but in the veneer of it's the whole neoliberal story. If people are interested in a long podcast on this topic of how the Powell memo led directly to our current Supreme Court, there's a podcast called Master Plan, which is, I think it's like 10 sessions long, so it's a lot. But it's really extraordinary at how well organized this plot was, that's led to Citizens United, but also the current makeup of the Supreme Court. But anyway, I'm digressing. So culture, rights, and economic. You're about to jump into another one of his big ideas.
Yeah, another one of those big ideas that's I wouldn't say unique to RSF, right? And these are all accessible, freely accessible. These ideas is what he called associative economics, which really delves into this idea of how can we be collaborative rather than competitive in a business setting or in economic processes, in value generation and value chains. So there's a lot that can be said about that. And again, a lot has been written about stakeholder economics, stakeholder capitalism, donut economics. I mentioned that before. So there's a whole body of work that has developed over the last couple of hundred years. Some of it even going back as far as Adam Smith, who in many ways was misunderstood or misinterpreted,
Mm.
co-opted for agendas. That's maybe a whole different conversation. But associative economics as an idea of centering cooperation and not competition
Mm.
as the central idea in economic life, very much on a macro level.
Mm.
Um,
Which,
and
at one level,
yeah,
we in this country could sort of dismiss that as well. It's a socialist idea. But again, in reality, it's actually in alignment with how living systems work. Um, as Janine Benyus taught me that in nature, species and organisms, organisms compete, but species evolve to find niches where they don't have to compete. They can find a place where they contribute to the health of the whole without
yeah,
competing. That's kind of the whole idea. And yet,
exactly.
um,
Yeah,
because we're trapped in this, it's either socialism or capitalism. We treat something like fraternité coming from the French as, oh, it must be socialist, as opposed to, oh, that's the way life works. Um, so,
that really resonates with me, John. And also the choice of words can lead us down a path that's just not helpful. Fraternité being one of them. It's like, why is it only brotherhood? Like,
yeah,
how is that
yeah,
inclusive?
fair point.
Yes, great
Yeah,
point. So how do we find the right words that describe what we actually mean?
yeah,
And that has been a challenge for us over the years. And I think with this rebranding that you mentioned, of really nailing those 5 principles that are informed by a lot of ideas and ideals
yeah,
and aren't exclusively, really not exclusively informed by Steiner's economic thinking.
yeah. And actually, I want to
Yeah,
also clarify because we throw around speaking of words and meaning, we throw around the term principles all the time. And I just want to observe you and I are using principles to mean something quite different.
yeah,
There are principles of action, I would call them, which is how I would describe the RSF principles. Here's how we are going
yes,
to behave. Here's what's important to us. Here's what we value, and hold us accountable to those statements. When I talk about first principles of living systems, I'm actually not making any declarative statement about action or ethics or ideology. I'm talking about first principles, which are, at best attempt to discern, I dare to use the word truth, reality, descriptive reality of how life, in my case, in the case of living systems principles, the principles that describe best how life works. And they're only first principles because an effort to reduce them further runs into you lose more than you gain by reducing them from a number. So they're irreducible first principles, which isn't to say that they're right or correct or the truth, but they're the best effort to understand how something works. And I think first principles is a term that probably originates in physics, but I'm using it in that same way. Graham says yes. But in physics, first principles can be reduced to math.
right.
In complex living systems, first principles, to draw on Bob Ulanowicz's phrase, are really they're more like patterns or tendencies toward than they are reducible to math, which is why it's squishier. But anyway, I've digressed, but I think it's important to clarify.
I think that's a really important distinction. And in the end, we at RSF are practitioners, right? So
Right.
it's about, you know, doing the work of providing funding and always standing in that tension between you have ideals and there's the reality.
Yeah.
of the actual loan that you need to make or the investment you need to make or these but embracing that tension, I think, is part of the work, and it's part of
Yeah.
what we do at RSF. John, I'm
Do you
I'm
guys
I'm
ever
curious.
engage? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was
Well,
just going to
I
ask.
was going to say that
Oh,
I'm curious if at this point it would be um, you would mind elaborating a little bit on the 8 principles of regenerative economics for the folks who haven't heard that, because I've happily been responding to your questions, but I would also like to embed it in those founding
sure.
principles that
Um,
that I mentioned were really important to us.
yeah, I'll see if I can remember them. I think I think what's most important really is the idea that there are first principles, that there are patterns that describe how life works. That's more important than John's best effort to describe them, because the big idea of regenerative economics and regenerative finance, and I'll come to that in a second, is that the economy is a living system, a business is a living system, any organization is a living system, and so my simplistic diagnosis of the poly crisis is that we manage the economy, we manage organizations, we manage relationships um, as if the economy and organizations are machines to be optimized. And so it's this fundamental confusion, sloppy thinking about the difference between building a machine that's complicated and managing complexity, which is any organism, whether it's our own bodies or General Motors. So the principles I've written about are, and it'll take too long to go through any detail, but the idea of working in right relationship, the idea of empowered participation. A living system is only healthy if all the parts of the system are empowered to participate, which is a which is completely aligned with, and we're going to shift to the DEI blowback in a second. So it's completely aligned with the DEI objective and agenda, but it's actually arguing from the perspective of first principles of a healthy system as opposed to being an ethical statement alone. It happens to nicely align with an ethics, but it is not dependent on the ethics. So empowered participation honors community in place. Living systems happen in place, they occur in place. So the whole growing rise of interest in bioregionalism. Someone just put it on the chat. Thank you, John.
Right.
The renewed interest, it's not new interest, it's renewed interest in bioregionalism and the great work that Samantha Power is doing is an expression of the reality that our culture, our economies need to be grounded in place, however we define place, which doesn't mean trivial little local, it means bioregional reality. Balance. What else have I forgotten? I can talk for hours about all these. Robust circulation, an economy is metabolism, an organization is a metabolism, not just of energy and matter, but of information critically. Um, and I'm sure I've missed a couple, but they're up on the screen. But I guess where I was going to go to flip it back at you is,
Sure.
do you guys work with your clients? I mean, you have a wonderful list of clients who are almost by definition, at the bleeding edge of the regenerative economy. And one of the things that many people miss when they think about regenerative economy is they think it's about the business and the products and services, not about how the organization works as an organization. Is it a healthy organization? Is it a regenerative organization? Does it manifest potential as a living organism? And it would seem to me that ought to be one of the business lines of a regenerative finance enterprise is to advise on how to be a regenerative organization. even if you're in the, I'll just be provocative, even if you're in the, candy business or
Yeah.
the petroleum business, you could actually operate internally in a regenerative way or a degenerative way.
That's such a great point, and thank you for indulging this little excursion into the eight principles. Um, so I think yes, in the end, it's a lot. I wouldn't say it's all about, but a lot is about the how. It's how we do things and how we collaborate and how organizations actually work. The what is not unimportant, but to your point, you could be a candy factory and still have a regenerative business model and a regenerative culture. So this is actually an ongoing conversation or inquiry at RSF where we're thinking about what does a regenerative culture look like? What does it look like to regenerate? Can we regenerate as individuals? What does that look like?
Right.
And what does, I mean, our Chief Operating Officer, Michelle, is really thinking about what does regenerative strategy look like? So if you're thinking about organizational strategic planning and strategy, what's a process that in which you actually embed these first principles, these living systems principles in your thinking about strategy? So, are we at a point where we can teach everybody else? I wouldn't say so. We're thinking about it and
Yeah.
we're learning and listening to a lot of the clients that we work with.
Yeah. Well, this is an area that, and I see Steve Dobo's on the call. We work, and I now use the word we liberally, including my partners at In Rhythm. We work with companies, no matter what business they're in, to foster a regenerative culture inside the organization, with the idea that that will, unleash potential in the human beings that are the key to the organization. And it's early days, but we've got some, I think, quite exciting outcomes. I would say buds beginning to break through the surface and potentially turn into flowers. But I think that's the big place to start. That's quite different from the sustainability agenda and the circular economy agenda. It is sort of the low-hanging fruit that's sitting right before our eyes, is to learn how to cause people to be engaged at work again, as opposed to feeling extracted from at work. And the nonprofit industry is probably the worst in terms of how we have a mission to do good, and then we extract from the people that are working in the industry. But um, I want to switch us to, a harder conversation before we bring in the whole community, and maybe the first thing we'll do is ask Jeffrey if we did some minimal justice to Rudolf Steiner. But we live in a moment now that is profoundly unique, and one of the aspects of it is this blowback on the the whole idea of DEI. The whole idea has been in the United States, ridiculed as woke capitalism. And laws are being changed, textbooks are being changed. I mean, it's actually quite terrifying what's happening. And the irony is that the entire DEI, ESG initiative was always woefully inadequate to deal with the challenges in the first place. And now we're seeing blowback on it. And my perception is that the time you've been at RSF has been a time where RSF has really taken to heart, I'll call it the DEI agenda, internally and with your clients. And so, I'm not asking for any answers, but I'm curious how not just you personally, but your organization is responding to this, what I'll call woke blowback. Um,
Yeah, that's a great question, John. And it's 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 a very difficult one, and it's also very easy in a way. I would say, you know, DEI and ESG. Oh, I see them popping up in the chat as well. So these three-letter acronyms, right? Diversity, equity, and inclusion, and in the investing world, environmental, social, and governance aspects. Those three-letter words have become four-letter words, right? It's like yeah, politically in the current political climate. And I think the trap in so many things, but including in this, is to view this as binary, as it's either good or it's bad. And going back to the first principles of living systems, inclusion and justice and call it love are at the core of what drives us and or what should drive us. So there was especially in 2020 and 2021, a lot of virtue signaling and performative DEI statements by companies and everybody suddenly had a DEI statement and all of that. For RSF, that journey actually started earlier than that, and with internal reflections and really thinking about who do we fund, how do we feel about, or how do we reflect on the reality of unconscious bias, right? That's a known fact. That's not political, right? It's real. How do we reflect on that? How do we make sure that we find a relationship to that? So fast forward to today, where now this, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives are being seen as political. We're saying we're still all in on building an inclusive economy because that's what we're about. Like that doesn't change. We're still convinced that the current economic system is leading to gross inequalities and it's far from equitable. So whatever we can do to contribute to that, absolutely. And making sure that we don't pull this into a political discussion, but really go back to what are the basic principles here and what is required if you are serious about changing finance and financing change. What do we need to think about? And so there's that. And then there are lawsuits against funds that have really focused on specifically on funding Black women, BIPOC women in the United States, and that really have, a lens of providing funding to those who were traditionally marginalized and who have systemically been shut out. So that's also a reality. So there's a legal reality there that these lawsuits are a real risk for organizations that take this seriously. We are not going to change our stand on any of this. We're not, as RSF, we're not. I said to the team the other day, they won't have me, but I wouldn't join those tech bros in the front row at the inauguration. Not in a million years. That's not what's required. Now it's about backbone. It's about standing what you stand for. And for us, that's very clear.
Yeah, but
And
Jasper, you don't have as much to lose.
well,
They stand for what they stand for because they have so much to lose,
well, that may be true,
which
but
might earn them the moniker deplorable in some circles, certainly in mine, but I won't go
it's
there.
yeah, that's true. We don't have trillions of enterprise value to lose. But I think it's important, going back to standing for principles, being principle based, and regardless of the political wind, those principles, I think, need to be really strong and not politicized. That's how I personally very strongly feel about it. I do have my political opinions, like we can go there, but um, I don't think that in this context of DEI and so-called wokeness, it's useful to pull that into a political discourse.
There's an interesting comment in the chat from Gopi. I can't see. Are you?
Sorry, my camera is off.
Can you share your thought and just explain it? I think it's very very astute, Gopi.
Yeah, because I was noticing that the policies, the sources of the policies that were coming out with ESG predominantly being pushed by, pretty large financial interests. You had, Vanguard and BlackRock coming out and saying this is what we need and so on. And then again, you have the DEI, which got completely entangled in the politics. So you have the big fight between Republicans and Democrats. And coming from India, it's different. We live in a different political climate. We don't see that much kind of cultural questions being fought out in the political realm. So it's easier to spot that. So both of these things got caught up in the wrong sphere. The original sphere where they're supposed to make the changes is you're actually asking for cultural changes, how human to human relationships and things grow and improve.
And when you say sphere, just to be clear, you're saying Steiner's threefold spheres.
Yeah, that you mentioned earlier, because culture
Yeah.
has everything to do with communities. It has to do with like anything that you take up, whether you take up this community or that community, this language, this gender, whatever. It's all
Yeah.
belongs in the cultural sphere. When you try to make those changes from the other spheres, it becomes toxic very fast as a
Yeah.
system. So I think we are facing
I
the
think that's
for
such a
that.
great point, Gopi, and I didn't think of it for sure. The way the way I've critiqued it, it's the same issue, but you've articulated it better. One thing that drives me crazy is that we somehow think we need to make the business case for
Yeah,
sustainability and the business case for DEI and the business case for this, that, and the other thing, as if something doesn't make more money, it's not worthy.
yep,
And the entire business school system has fallen into that trap because that's what they teach is the
yep,
business case for this, that, and the other thing.
yep,
And it's very seductive. And some things have a business case,
yep.
but some things don't.
No.
And yet we don't have a threefold way of seeing things. We have
Yep,
a single fold way, which is if it's good for business, it's good.
yep,
And so you have the tech bros in the front row of the Trump inauguration.
yep, yep, yep. Absolutely. I agree.
Very interesting. Um, so Jasper, just going back then, in a sense, you're saying it's easy because our response is nothing's changed. We're committed, etc.
Yes.
And I certainly get that, and obviously I respect that completely. Um, is there anything that you think, and I actually need to think more about what Gopi just said because I actually think that's the answer to how did we get ourselves so twisted up in knots about the nuances between. I mean, I was just reading something about, it was an op-ed talking about in the military and how, oh, I know, it was in the New York Times and what's his name? Stevens, I think, or whatever. He was saying it's good that we don't have DEI in the military because we need warriors and strength matters. And yet it's again this trap into this binary, as if everyone in the military is working as a gunner on a tank. There's millions of people that work in the military, and most of them never see battle. And yet we can reduce it to you're either stronger than the next person or you're not. And if you're a woman, how could you be stronger? It's just we're in a sense, we're just so stupid the way we think about things. It's almost like we deserve our problems because we're so intellectually lazy about how we think about them. So thanks for staying on a little extra, Jasper, and thanks for your fascinating discussion and all your good work to you and your team. I'm overdue for a visit. I haven't been to your new headquarters, so
We'll
next
have
time I'm
you
on the West Coast.
anytime. Yeah.
All right.
Thank you, John. Thank you, everybody. This was
Thanks,
so
everyone.
wonderful to share this space with you.